recognizing there is some controversy around the definition of psychedelics, for the purposes of this panel, we're going to be discussing classic psychedelics, such as LSD and psilocybin, and pathogens like MDMA, and we're also going to discuss dissociative anesthetics like ketamine, even though those are not strictly not defined as a psychedelic. So psychedelics, in our capacious definition for today, are drugs that influence physiological, cognitive, and emotional states. Some of us have heard very moving personal testimony from individuals who have benefited immensely from psychedelic-assisted therapy, especially veterans. There's also very promising science and research around the potential for psychedelics as a treatment for mental health conditions and a tool to enhance well-being. Even though the studies so far have had relatively small sample sizes and blinding is pretty challenging to conduct in this field. But there's also some very serious potential side effects. As of yet, many experts say there's not enough clinical research and evidence to take these drugs out of the research setting. However, with the passage of Measure 109 in Oregon, wellness centers offering supervised ingestion of psilocybin will be open to the public as early as next year. Prop 122 in Colorado would open similar centers in 2024, followed by other types of psychedelics. So it seems like the genie's out of the bag, and perhaps it's not a question of if, but when psychedelics become more widely available. And at TBI, since we are really focused on pragmatic policies, we've gathered this amazing panel here today to talk about if psychedelic-assisted therapy is going to be scaled, what are the technologies, the policies, and the practices we can leverage to make sure it's done so safely and ethically. So first, our panelists will introduce themselves, and then we'll have a bit of a fireside chat and leave some time at the end for audience questions. So let's start with Berra.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Berra Yazar-Klosinski. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of MAPS, which is a nonprofit. It stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. The nonprofit has been in effect since 1985. And the primary reason that the nonprofit was founded was to follow the FDA regulated process for clinical development of MDMA, 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, as an adjunct to psychotherapy, and generate risk and benefit information in a balanced manner, and see what happens, see what the data shows. So this concept actually came out of a couple decades of clinical experimentation of therapists who are in clinical practice, testing out different dosing regimens and finding what works. So it was an empirical development process that took place. And so we were able to circumvent the typical drug development process where you do a high throughput screening, identify a target, spend a lot of money, maybe get 2 hits, and then, somewhere in phase 3, it fizzles out and dies. And so we've been very fortunate in that the clinical observations that were actually published in 1986, 1998, really ended up panning out. And I hadn't even looked at the articles until just recently, after working at MAPS for 13 years. Just to refresh my memory, I revisited the 80s and saw, surprisingly, that the things we're seeing in our data were already known back then. And just doing a little revisit of these seminal articles was sufficient to show that I think there's true power in what psychedelics can provide. However, as we also heard earlier, maybe we don't even need to have a medication to improve what we call now is the inner directed healer. So this is not just about giving a magic pill to a person and listening to them talk. It's about empowering them as autonomous beings to understand that the healer is inside of them, and the whole phenomenology behind the use of psychedelics in a controlled setting with appropriately trained guides and facilitators is to enable the individual to have the sense of psychological safety, self-empowerment, to take that courageous step and change and shift the way that they think about themselves. So just as you saw earlier with Byron Katie, it doesn't take a lot. This is something that could just happen in a day. You just shift your perspective. And so what we found in our more rigorously conducted controlled clinical trials is that MDMA and many other psychedelics that we know about are capable of increasing a personality trait known as openness to experience. And they're also simultaneously, just like psychotherapy, able to reduce neuroticism, and these correlate with clinical outcomes. So together, there's a synergistic effect of therapy with the psychedelics. And what I do today is I talk to government agencies and tell them about this stuff, and I do a lot of writing and publishing. And I think that the work here is going to be very impactful with the help of policymakers and innovative thinkers like yourselves in the audience.
That's great, Berra. My name is Jeffrey Becker, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at Bexon Biomedical, which is an early stage pharma company. I think it's probably important to explain how I got to what we're doing at Bexon. I'll explain what we're doing there, but why am I up on stage here? I had a life-changing experience with psychedelics when I was in college. I was watching a certain aspect of myself, a kind of transcendent sense of the world, kind of being able to touch the numinous as a child disappear. And it was very distressing to me. And I was at Berkeley. I sought out answers. I went to the philosophy department, found out very quickly that was not where you go. Ended up working with Houston Smith in the religious studies department and studying mysticism, and also discovered psychedelics and mushrooms in particular. And they completely changed my life in the sense of kind of rediscovering an aspect of myself. It wasn't even college poison; it was developmental poison in a sense of this kind of diminishment of consciousness. I went into medicine in order to study psychedelics, but it was a little too early for that. I had the luck of actually having a chance to try ketamine while I was in medical school, actually my first semester, and I knew what I was going to study for the rest of my life. After that, it was such a profound and rapid change in consciousness from an ion channel blocker, which is just such an unbelievable mystery how that could actually bring about such a profound change so quickly. The fact that it was legal was amazing. And we were just discovering really how important the NMDA receptor was in mental health. So I studied that deeply, did a lot of work mapping the kind of phenomenology that you see in mystic cosmology upon the kind of trip reports from nitrous oxide and ketamine, and then down to the level of the early neurology about what we knew was happening with ketamine. We now know a lot more. It's a lot of fun what the functional imaging is showing us now. So I will fast forward to working for about 20 years in clinical care. I have just me sat through thousands of ketamine assisted psychotherapy sessions with patients. My practice was in Los Angeles. And about 5 years ago, I realized that if we were ever going to solve the opioid crisis, one of the important starting points, a lot of things have to happen, but one of the most important starting points was we had to develop a potent non-opioid medication for pain management, especially in postoperative pain. Postoperative pain management is one of the major entrees into addiction. There's a huge number of people. It's probably about 160,000 Americans every year. And some portion of those, it's just a numbers game, end up addicted. And some of them just end up dead. We lost more people last year than all of the Vietnam War on the American side, at least. So we've got people dying left and right, and it's so tragic. It's hard to even really explain if you don't deal with it directly. The children that lose their parents when they're in their prime and have to grow up without that influence. So we set about solving the ketamine problem for pain and decided that we would repurpose the insulin-like pump device technology, which is just kind of sitting there like a little Ferrari that needs to be repurposed, in my opinion, for ketamine. Ketamine is very difficult to put into this subcutaneous tissue because it's a little bit like salty orange juice. And we developed a new bit of chemistry, and we have a subcutaneous formulation that is friendly to this tissue. It's isotonic and it's pH balanced, and it's potent enough to make a little wearable for post-surgical care. We have also found out that the same technology that hacked ketamine can hack the psychedelics. And we've been running through a number of different psychedelic formulations: DMT, 5-methoxy-DMT, mescaline. We have others. We have pathogens as well in the benzofuran class and the aminoindane classes, if you guys are following any of this. And at this point, we're just trying to figure out maybe what the next steps are. We're going forward with ketamine specifically for pain, and then we will branch into mental health and also possibly into glioblastoma and other neurological disorders and neuro-oncology, which is often driven by NMDA receptor hyperactivation and glutamatergic overdrive. So that's how we got here, and I feel very grateful to be up here. I think it's an amazing room. It's an amazing panel. So.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ros, and so I worked with Psilocybin. So I worked with Robin Carhart-Harris, who is here at Imperial College, and we worked together on 2 Psilocybin for depression clinical trials. And I guess my own research with Psilocybin, my own interest with it, was really looking at what was really happening, what was the mechanism. And I did some qualitative research where I interviewed the participants of our first trial and just asked them, what did a mushroom experience, what did a psilocybin experience do? How did it impact you? And the response really was that it was an experience of going from extreme disconnection to connecting to self, other people, and the world around them, and especially nature, actually. So it was this process that people described that in depression, they were living in their heads, trapped in their heads with constant ruminations, negative thoughts. It was like their life had just got smaller and smaller until they were just living up here. And then the psilocybin experience somehow allowed people to, that focus just opened wider and wider until they could feel their senses. They could feel their emotions, their bodies. They could connect to other people in their lives for the first time properly, connect not just to the people they knew, but just to a sense of global humanity. And then even wider, the circle gets bigger and bigger. They started connecting to nature and sometimes a source of universal love and a spiritual essence. And finally, a sense that everything is connected, everything is interconnected, and that they themselves are part of nature and that they are part of an interconnected web of life, which is amazing, to going from living in your head, like living in your ego, stuck in here, to feeling part of everything. But tragically, or not tragically, actually, it felt tragically at the time to realize it, that sense of connectedness kind of shut down again after a while. So it was this huge expansion and then a contraction over time, because people are going from this trial and this experience back into a toxic world, toxic soil. They're going back into toxic ground of disconnectedness, of an individualized world where it's hard to get help, where everyone is so stressed and going so fast that any kind of sense of connectedness just can fall away quite quickly. So essentially, I realized that we needed something for maintaining this sense of connectedness. So I'm now focusing on an integration community, which is an online community, and it's for people after psychedelic experiences, or just after. It's actually for anyone, because I think life at the moment is kind of a psychedelic experience in many ways. And it's for people to come together and work on a year-long process for maintaining connectedness to self, others, and nature.
Thank you. And as you see on the screen, we were supposed to be joined by one more panelist, but he can't make it on stage today. So he prepared some remarks, and I'll read his introduction. So Yuri is the founder and CEO of Homecoming, a patient care platform for psychedelic therapists and coaches. After studying mathematical physics at the University of Waterloo, Yuri spent the last 15 years building tech products, some of them being used by hundreds of millions of people like Keek Messenger. Not sure if I pronounced that right. Keek, Kick. Okay. After helping launch 7 years ago the world's first scalable AI augmented mental health safety net used by millions across several major social networks, Yuri committed the rest of his career to the intersection of mental health care and technology. In parallel to all the tech work, Yuri has been involved in psychedelics for 17 years and has had his life turned around after a major depression with the help of an ayahuasca trip a decade ago. Since then, Yuri has been a founding team member at Heroic Hearts Project, helping veterans in the US, UK, and Canada access psychedelic treatments for war trauma. Out of work with the veteran community, he got the Vision for Homecoming platform, which helps scale the integration therapy process. Yuri lives in Toronto and is currently deeply involved in the efforts for post-war trauma recovery of Ukrainians and with the help of psychedelic therapies. So you, all three of you touched on this a little bit with Berra speaking about the open-heartedness, but I'd like you to briefly touch on what makes psychedelic assisted therapy different from other treatments that are available right now, or even just from hours of work one-on-one with a therapist. I mean, we can start with Berra.
Yeah, we spend a lot of time thinking about this actually, mainly because we're doing our studies primarily modeled after psychotherapy research studies, meaning that all of the similar aspects that you would expect for any other evidence-based psychotherapy, we have created for MDMA-assisted therapy. We have a treatment manual, we have adherence criteria, we have rating groups that review the content of psychotherapy sessions and then provide ratings according in terms of how much the treatment manual was followed. And so we have a pretty similar way of looking at what is this psychedelic assisted therapy. And what comes out of that work is that most of the evidence-based therapies that are available today and have been launched across the VA and elsewhere are really focused on exposure. They're characterized as exposure-based therapies, meaning that in the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, the traumatic event is revisited, and this is done in a manner that is intended to eventually dull the avoidance response and enable the individual to tolerate thinking about that traumatic event. And in contrast to that, psychedelic assisted therapies are really focused on development of self-compassion and compassion for others. And there's, in fact, a new wave, I think, of interest in compassion-based therapies as a way of progressing this issue around what's the right kind of psychotherapy to deliver. So I hope that maybe you can add some.
It really is a great question because it's a bit of a mystery what happens in the room, and there's a lot of theories about what's happening in the room. I do a fair amount of teaching about the nature of at least ketamine assisted psychotherapy, and in the case of ketamine, there's a very big difference actually between the quality of the psychedelics versus ketamine, and I want to be clear about that. We don't really have the time to get into that too deeply. They're very, very different in how they feel. They end up kind of arriving at the same endpoint, which is an expansion of mind and a release of the controlling forces that actually circumscribe and stereotype thinking. And so breaking down those stereotypes, breaking down sometimes we'll call them the default mode network or the network relationships, that kind of thing, but breaking that down and allowing areas of the brain to talk to each other that are not normally allowed to talk to each other is a powerful experience for patients because there's aspects of who they are that have been shielded off from themselves. They rediscover inner resources, aspects of who they are, this kind of deeply enriching and rediscovery, almost like they've moved out of that liminal state back into fully like real, recapturing what they've lost, what we lose in adolescence as we move into adulthood. This kind of sense of feeling estranged, sometimes feeling abandoned, that we kind of can't even put our finger on. There's a sense a lot of times of just feeling like a child of God all of a sudden. So what is going on, at least in psychotherapy, in the ketamine space, it's deeply symbolic. And that is something that is not necessarily always material that you deal with in normal psychotherapy. Maybe in psychoanalysis, at least it's pushing in that direction. It's a bit kind of programmatic, I think, analysis. But when you're dealing with patients and they have this kind of imagery, and that imagery has kind of an archetypal significance, there's a sense of meaning that is very difficult to fully grasp until you see it. You're really getting a missive from the deep self at some level. You're getting something that's coming up as an offering of like a primary aspect of what they are. If you can capture those symbols, it's actually in some ways it's very easy. In some ways it's very hard. You have to be there and you have to work with the patient. But if you can capture those symbols and work with that symbolism with patients going forward, they get to keep it. And it's partly why it's so important to have, I think, there be at least mindful sitting, even with ketamine. Sometimes there's a debate about whether you need that or not. I think you do, or at least if you have that present, you get more leverage, and you don't need the treatments as often. You just get so much more mileage.
Okay, so as a follow-up to that, say it's 5 years from now, and Leanne, Jody, and Mike and Ruth, their methods have led your primary care physician to determine that you are a subtype that would really benefit from psychedelic assisted therapy. What would that therapeutic process look like under the protocols that you're developing, and what might the indications be for someone to benefit from them? Maybe start with Roz.
So it would be very different for the 3 different psychedelics we're all representing. Maybe I'll talk a bit about psilocybin, and then you can both. Yeah, although there are some similarities as well. There are big similarities, and I love what you said then, Jeff, about these learnings from the deep self coming up and the symbols, and yeah, beautiful. So with psilocybin, the psychedelic assisted therapy kind of protocol at the moment is we have 3 phases. Well, there's actually 5 phases actually. So the first phase is screening, which is very, very important. So there are lots of contraindications for psychedelic assisted therapy. And so the screening process has to be done very, very carefully. The next phase is the preparation phase. And that also can't be rushed. And that's really about developing trust. So that's for the therapist, or therapists, plural. In our work, we had 2 therapists with the participant all day. So that was sitting in a room all day long with 2 therapists. So it's quite kind of labor intensive. But we had good reasons for thinking that we needed to keep both. So the preparation phase, the therapist, you don't need both therapists in the prep session. Spend quite a long time with the participant, and that's for really understanding where they're at, what their fears are, really explaining about how psilocybin works, about how important trust is, letting go, about how you might feel that you want to kind of cling on to the edge of the cliff, but you have to just kind of like in abseiling, just like jump off, otherwise it's going to be really, really painful on the way down. So you have to trust that you're going to be held and you're going to be caught, but that you have to really kind of just surrender to whatever comes up. I think that's the main lesson in the prep phase. It's like, just let it happen. Just say yes to it. It might really hurt, but just trust and say yes and see what you learn. And we're here with you, So that the prep phase is all about really establishing that sense of trust and the willingness of the participant to be able to let go in that way, to jump off that edge of that mountain, which is really, really hard often. Then the next phase is the actual session itself. And that is, the music is the first thing that comes to me. We have specific playlists that are made for us. And the music is so important. You need a special kind of heart opening music that really opens the heart, kind of Ben Kalin that we work with at Imperial always says, it's bittersweet. It's the music that doesn't guide you to happiness or sadness, but it just provides the space for the heart to really sing and open and let out all of its grief. And so the playlist is very important. And we have the two guides sitting there, the participant lying on a kind of bed sofa thing. They wear eye shades, they put their headphones on, they take the psilocybin, and then the guides sit there. They sit there with the music playing, and they go into their deepest emotions. They go deep, deep down. And sometimes they need support from the guides, sometimes they don't. And then at the end of the day, they talk through where they've been and the symbols, and you piece it together a bit. And then the next day is the next phase, which is the kind of first bit of integration. And then the fifth stage, which is basically talking through what happened and where they went. And then the fifth phase, which is often missed out of psychedelic therapy protocols, is long-term community integration together to ground the work, to plant the seed of the lesson that you it's like the gift that you're given. You see it like a shining pearl, but you need to go and plant that pearl like a seed so it can grow into something that you can keep watering and feeding and nurturing for the rest of your life.
So I know you said the process is different for the different substances, but I'd love to move on to some of the policy questions. So this process you're describing, Roz, is very labor intensive. It sounds like it requires a lot of therapy hours. It requires a lot of infrastructure. So I guess my question to each of you is that how can psychedelic assisted therapy be scaled safely and in a way that maintains the integrity of the therapeutic process? Maybe we can start with Jeff.
Well, it's a great question, and I think there are a lot of people trying to solve this problem. I think that there are a lot of molecules. We're in a very interesting situation where there is a huge amount of human data and trip reports, basically, subjective reports about what these different molecules feel like. And to some extent, there's a lot of information about safety as well. So safety and quasi-efficacy, very interesting, before we have any animal data on a lot of these molecules. So there's a huge amount of interest in kind of mining that data, looking at some of the Shulgin archive molecules that we already know a lot about, MDMA, but also some more obscure molecules. What we're looking at Bexon as well is the possible benefits to the industry, to human beings, to kind of tuning to the medical model. There is the community model, there's indigenous use, there's all kinds of different ways to look at this. I happen to have my work is in this field, which is kind of more square drug development. So we're trying to tune to the medical model, and we believe at least that if you can control time frames by avoiding the GI tract, again, this parenteral subcutaneous delivery, that we can reduce side effects by not sending the drugs by the gut and creating malaise and kind of a roiling visceral noise that often shapes a trip and can be kind of a negative experience. You can control the onset, the altitude, and the exit as well, which is kind of important in a medical setting. And that you can, I think, very vastly reduce interpatient variability as well. So lots of problems to solve. I think that the pharmacokinetics of these drugs are going to be an important thing for us to look at in terms of making it available.
And I'd like to add that we're active. So our mission as MAPS Public Benefit Corporation is to integrate these therapies into the healthcare system globally. And so this is no small task. And what we're finding is that the current health system is highly variable from country to country. And just, comparing the US versus Germany, for example, in Germany, 5 different psychotherapies are covered through the healthcare system. They are reimbursed. The total number of hours that the health system reimburses for is on the order of 60 hours of psychotherapy. So this is actually more than what we are looking at in terms of MDMA assisted therapy. And the fact that the psychotherapy hours or the therapy hours are condensed is an advantage in that we're looking at a process of intensive change over 3 months. And the staffing and facility utilization is something that we're really honing in on, as well as the number of person hours needed in order to safely supervise and what the credentials are of those personnel. So in our studies, we didn't have a physician on site staring at the patient as they are going through their experience. The physician wrote a prescription. It's like it'll fit within a 30-minute medication management framework that already exists as a CPT code out there in the U.S. health system. In addition, in our phase 3 studies, we really thought about how this might be modeled in clinical practice, and we had at least one licensed therapist working within the scope of their practice as a behavioral health provider. So really broadening the understanding of, the role of nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and other paraprofessionals as being suitable in terms of their qualifications in order to lessen the burden on the health system as we try to integrate and scale.
Do you want to talk to this?
Yeah, so I think with psilocybin assisted therapy, in terms of scaling, one of the things I think we are seeing is people having experiences, and this actually is not just from clinical trials, but also people going to have truffle retreats in the Netherlands, and people just experiencing mushrooms in various different ways. That because this feeling of connectedness is often so lovely. And particularly lovely if you've had really serious depression, if that sense of relief is so wonderful, that as it starts to fade, people want to have another experience. So some people are getting into this kind of habit of having a mushroom experience and then kind of wanting to have another mushroom experience, and then the kind of feeling of connectedness starts to fade, and then they want another one. And I think we'd see that in the medical model as well, of this kind of sense of they're not addictive substances, but you can get dependent on the feeling that you get from them if you're not doing the work, the integration work. So in terms of scaling, I think having a really strong network of integration work after these experiences will mean that rather than wanting another experience with the medicine, people will do the work in community of actually really deepening the process within themselves. And so that will really ease the kind of the flow. And also, I think it'll be much safer, because sometimes after these experiences, people feel very raw. So much stuff that when that deep self comes up. So, I mean, we haven't really talked about how viscerally challenging and agonizing and terrifying these experiences can be. And even when that's beautiful, because people learn so much, pain as a teacher, it truly, truly is. And when people are encouraged to find the lessons in their pain, it can be transformative, but they're still left feeling very, very raw often afterwards. So having these kind of integration communities makes it safer to scale, because as more and more people try it, there'll be a really robust container for people that understand. Because the other thing about our society is that, unlike indigenous plant medicine using cultures who have a long lineage in this work, and their whole society is set up around it, and they understand it, and you can talk to your auntie or your whoever about it, and they get it. In our culture, we're not there yet. So we're introducing these kind of incredibly powerful, sacred tools into a community, a culture that doesn't really have a process for it yet. So in order to make it safe to do it, we need to build a container and the safety structure and the understanding around us all.
And that person's community as well, right? I mean, if they go home and they're getting pushback from family who don't understand what was happening in the room, or why all of a sudden these new ideas are being brought home, that can be very threatening. We really have to be mindful of that and build that container for everybody, not just the patient.
Well, when you have somebody who's sick in your family, there's certain behaviors that develop within that family that actually continue the sickness of the individual, because there's a caretaking mode of action that develops around the individual. So that's why this is really about community work and rebuilding societal structures and looking at socioeconomic determinants of health to examine what's the risk, what's the benefit, and how could the benefit potentially have durability.
Thank you. I have some closing words from our shadow panelist, Yuri. So obviously the war in Ukraine has led to millions of traumatized people. So Yuri is setting up a pilot clinical trial that would investigate the efficacy of MDMA on war-inflicted trauma in Ukrainian refugees sheltering in Europe. This is because now psychedelic-assisted therapy is not legal in Ukraine. We have brought on board MAPS and ARQ Center for Trauma Therapy in the Netherlands. Both organizations are willing to work together to conduct an MDMA PTSD study on Ukrainian refugees at cost. Not only refugees suffering from trauma will be treated, but Ukrainian therapists will be trained and brought on board to help in therapy in the future. Should the results of such a study be positive, it could be expanded and replicated in other European centers, and most importantly, serve as a basis for enabling psychedelic-assisted therapy as a viable and valuable PTSD treatment modality in Ukraine. If you feel called and are able to support this trial financially, please reach out to Yuri at yuri@homecoming.health or through his website. But thank you from the bottom of my heart, Slava Ukraini. So thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to Yuri for tackling the enormous issue in the Ukraine. It's going to have ripple effects for years and years to come. So let's give the thank you to the panelists.